Imagine for a second that you've just woken up, but not in your cozy apartment with an espresso machine and a crispy toast. Instead, you're in a dark, drafty hut. Outside, it's not even dawn, just some gray, slushy mess. It's cold, muddy, and maybe even snowing. Your stomach demands food, but there's no fridge, no store, no delivery. All you have is a hearth where embers have been smoldering for hours, and a clay pot with something edible left over from yesterday. Or maybe not. The question we're going to explore today, from every angle, is provocative and yet very practical. If you, a modern person, used to sauces, spices, sugar, fast food, and fresh salads in December, were teleported to 14th century Europe, say France or England, could you survive there? Not as a knight or a princess, but as an ordinary person. And more importantly, could you eat what they ate back then without getting sick? Let me say this right away. There will be no romantic images from Robin Hood movies, with everyone sitting at long tables eating roast boar and drinking wine. Or almost none. Because the real medieval diet and its time is, well, an extreme adventure for your digestive system. But an incredibly interesting one. Well, we'll go from a peasant's breakfast to a lord's feast. We'll find out why monks secretly ate bacon at night, and how cabbage saved Europe from total extinction. And at the end, I'll give you a harsh but honest verdict. Will you survive? Or will your body go on a hunger strike by day 3? Part 1. Grain, bread, and porridge, the stuff of life. If you had to compress the medieval diet into one word, that word would be grain. Not meat, not fish, not fruit, grain. About 70 or even 80% of everything a person put in their mouth, whether a beggar, a knight, or even a king, was grain in some form. Bread, porridge, stew, filled pies, all made from grain. But here's an important detail. The quality of the grain and bread determined everything. A poor person ate bread made from rye, barley, oats, or spelt. Wheat was too expensive. It was sold at market or given to the lord as rent. Peasant bread was black, heavy, and often had so many additives that a modern dentist would be horrified. Pea flour, bran, and in lean years, crushed acorns, roots, goosefoot, even straw were added. This bread was called twig bread, and it was genuinely hard to chew, but it provided energy for 10 to 12 hours of plowing or cathedral building. A rich person, on the other hand, ate white bread made from the finest wheat flour. This flour was sifted through a fine silk sieve, so expensive that today we'd compare it to buying a new iPhone for baking pastries. The bread itself was soft, porous, and so tender that even toothless old people could eat it. And by the way, in aristocratic houses, bread had another function. It was a plate. A large slice of stale bread, usually wheat, was placed on the table, meat or fish was laid on it, and then this trencher was either eaten by the servants or given to the beggars at the gate. Throwing away bread was considered a sin. A fallen piece was picked up and kissed. As for porridge, it was everything. It was cooked in water, milk, broth, and during Lent, in poppy seed or nut milk. Any grains went into the pot, often mixed. Onions, garlic, herbs, and if you were lucky, a piece of lard or a spoonful of honey were added. And here's something interesting. In the Middle Ages, there was no clear boundary between porridge and soup. Stew was just thin porridge. So if you think people ate monotonously, well, in a sense, they did. But within that monotony, there was a huge number of recipes. We just haven't inherited most of them. Part 2. vegetables we wouldn't recognize. Now for vegetables. Here's a surprise, and not a pleasant one. Everything you love in a salad, tomatoes, cucumbers, potatoes, sweet peppers, eggplants, corn, sunflower seeds, did not exist in medieval Europe. At all. They would only arrive from America 200 or 300 years later. So if you're a fan of French fries, I feel for you. So what did they have? Turnips, rutabagas, parsnips, parsley root, carrots, but they were purple or white. Orange carrots wouldn't be bred until the 17th century by the Dutch, in honor of the House of Orange. There was cabbage of all kinds, white, Savoy, and broccoli, which was considered a refined Italian delicacy. There were legumes, peas, lentils, fava beans. There were grains we now consider weeds, nettles, goosefoot, goutweed, wild garlic, sorrel. Mushrooms were gathered, but the nobility looked down on them, earthy growths for worms. But the poor loved them. And here's the main problem. In winter there were no fresh vegetables. None at all. From November to March you live on salted turnips, sauerkraut, and dried roots. No frozen mixes, no hothouse cucumbers. Only what you managed to salt, pickle, or dry back in September. And by the way, sauerkraut, without knowing it, saved people from scurvy, because it retains vitamin C. But of course they didn't know that back then. They just noticed those who eat sour cabbage don't lose their teeth or die from some strange disease. Another important point is the so-called lean years, when the grain harvest failed due to rain or drought. Then people switched to a pagan, famine diet, fern roots, moss, tree bark, crushed acorns. Such food kept the stomach full, but provided catastrophically little nutrition. People swelled from hunger, not from fat, but from edema, and it was terrifying. Part 3. Meat. A holiday that doesn't always come to you. Now let's talk about what historical films love to show. Meat. Roasted boar carcasses, spits with chickens, smoking ribs. Beautiful, right? For a poor person this was pure fantasy. A peasant ate meat rarely, very rarely. A few times a year, at Christmas, Easter, a wedding, or a fair. Why? Because a cow gave milk and pulled the plow. A sheep gave wool and also milk. A hen laid eggs. Butchering them for meat was simply unprofitable. You lost a daily product for one day of fullness. So the peasant's main meat animal was the pig. The pig is wonderful because it's omnivorous, grows fast, and can be fed on scraps and acorns. And pork can be salted, it keeps for months. Salt pork was a strategic winter reserve. What about game? Hare, rabbit, deer, wild boar in the forest? Theoretically, you could catch it. Practically, that was poaching. Forests belonged to the king or the local lord. Killing a deer without permission could get you executed, or, at best, have your hand cut off. So the poor risked their lives for a piece of meat. A wealthy household was another matter. There, meat was eaten every day, sometimes twice a day. They ate beef, pork, mutton, goose, chicken, swan, crane, heron, peacock. Yes, peacocks. They were roasted in their feathers, served with the tails spread out to make the guests gasp. This was less about taste and more about spectacle. They also ate beavers. Yes, beavers. Their scaly tails were declared fish by the Catholic Church, so they could be eaten on fast days. Clever, right? Spices were a separate obsession for the rich. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, they cost literally their weight in gold. A pound of nutmeg could cost as much as a cow. When a nobleman ordered meat with a huge amount of pepper, he wasn't just seasoning it, he was shouting to utter one, Look how rich I am. I can eat money. Spices also helped mask the taste of spoiled meat, but that's more myth than truth. Fresh meat was still valued more highly. Part 4. The difference between poor and rich. A whole world. If you think the dietary difference was simply the rich eat meat and the poor eat porridge, you're underestimating the scale. In the Middle Ages, food was perhaps the most important marker of social status. Even how you ate mattered. A poor person ate from a common bowl with their hands, a wooden spoon, or just a piece of bread used to scoop up stew. They sat on a wooden bench. They drank water or sour ale, a low-alcohol barley drink that was safer than water because the fermentation process killed bacteria. By the way, this is one reason even children in the Middle Ages drank small beer. It was cleaner than river water. A rich person ate from a pewter or silver plate. They had their own personal knife. Forks were just appearing in Italy and were considered almost diabolical. They drank wine, often watered down, not to save money, but because undiluted wine was considered barbaric. At an aristocrat's table, multiple courses were served, sometimes 10 to 15. Between courses came entremets, spectacular dishes, like a roasted swan in its feathers, or a pie from which live birds flew out. But perhaps the most amusing is the monastic diet. Monks were supposed to observe strict fasts, eat humble food, and abstain from meat entirely. But, as Abbott's complaints show, monks constantly cheated. They built separate houses for the sick, where they could secretly fry bacon. They declared chicken broth a medicine. And they ate fish, especially expensive salmon and sturgeon, with such gusto that it strained the monastery's budget more than maintaining an army. One French abbot in the 13th century complained, "The brothers demand fish as fresh as if they were kings of England." Part 5. What about dessert? Honey instead of sugar. Now for sweets. Let me warn you right away, if you're used to stress eating chocolate bars or cookies, you'll struggle in the Middle Ages, because there is almost no sugar. Cane sugar appeared in Europe only at the end of the 13th century, and it was so expensive that it was sold in apothecaries by weight, like gold. Yes, sugar was considered medicine. It was given for sore throats, for exhaustion, and for corrupted blood. So what replaced sugar? Honey. Honey was everywhere. It was gathered wild, risking your life by climbing trees for a swarm. And it was farmed. Beehives were in every monastery and every homestead. Honey sweetened porridges, pies, ale, and even meat dishes. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval cooks loved sweet meat, for example, pork with honey, cinnamon, and ginger. Fruits included apples, pears, plums, cherries, and quince. In southern Europe, figs, grapes, pomegranates, citrus fruits were extremely rare. They were brought from Arab lands and cost fantastically. Rich people ate candied orange and lemon peels. These were true luxury candies. The poor made do with baked apples or pears, and in winter, with soaked fruits from barrels. Another dessert everyone loved was marzipan, just not the kind in boxes today. Medieval marzipan was made from ground almonds, honey, and rosewater. Even well-off townspeople could afford it because almonds were more accessible than sugar. Marzipan decorated feast tables. It was molded into figures of saints, castles, even entire battle scenes. And yes, it was then eaten. Conclusion: would you survive? So, we come to the main question. Would you, a modern person, survive on a medieval diet? I promised an honest answer, and I'll give it to you. From a purely physiological standpoint, yes, you would survive. Your body can digest coarse fiber, legumes, fermented foods, and even salt pork. Moreover, the medieval diet was in many ways healthier than the modern Western diet. There were no trans fats, corn syrup, refined sugar, or packaged snacks. People ate whole grains, fermented vegetables, little sugar, and they had a much lower incidence of type 2 diabetes or obesity. But there are 3 buts that would likely kill you. First, hygiene. Medieval water, milk, and even ale could contain pathogens to which modern people have no immunity. Your sterile gut, raised on washed food and boiled water, might not handle an amoeba or salmonella. Second, vitamin deficiency in winter. Yes, sauerkraut helps, but if you end up in a region where it isn't made, scurvy will get you in 2 to 3 months. Third, psychology. The lack of variety, monotonous food day after day, the smell of sour ale, hearth smoke, and the absence of sugar. Within 2 weeks, you'll start hallucinating about a croissant. So here's my verdict. If you're teleported right now without preparation, you'll likely become seriously ill within the first week. But if you're given a month to adapt, gradually introducing coarse food, and if you have access to a clean water source, then yes, you could survive. You might even become stronger. Because the medieval diet was a peasant's diet, for those who plowed, chopped wood, and walked dozens of kilometers. It was made for a body that works. Now look at your own plate. Is there something on it today that a medieval person would call fantastic? Or would you want to try real black bread with salted turnips? Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. If you'd like a sequel, for example what people ate during wars or how they feasted at weddings, write in the comments. I wish you food that brings you joy and gives you strength. No rotten teeth and no acorns.